Today's text is Ruth chapter 2. The title is Ruth Picks Leftover Grain. First point, Ruth diligently picks up the leftover grain. Verses 1 to 7. Second point, God allows Ruth to succeed. Verses 8 to 16. Third point, Ruth honors her mother-in-law. Verses 17 to 23. Read verse 1. Now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side from the clan of Elimelech, of whose name was Boaz. Here it says, now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side from the clan of Elimelech, a man of standing. In the book of Ruth, the three main characters are Ruth, Naomi, and Boaz. The meaning of the name Boaz is man of standing. Hence, we can infer that he was wealthy and had an important position in the region. Just like the meaning of his name, he had power to save Naomi's family from difficulties. Just as Jesus from sin, Boaz was powerful enough to save the family of Naomi. Verses 2 to 3. And Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor. Naomi said to her, go ahead, my daughter. So she went out and began to glean in the fields behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she found herself working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. Ruth followed her mother-in-law to Bethlehem, but she could not find any work. Hence, in order to survive, she picked up leftover grain in the field. Picking up leftover grain was the only thing she could do because Naomi had no financial foundation due to her failure in Moab. This was not an honorable job. Still, Ruth picked up the leftover grain, which showed Ruth's state of humble faith. She did not become low because she picked up leftover grain. Her mindset to do whatever job was given to her was good. A believer must always have such a mindset. We must not only do convenient. Today, there are unemployed people all throughout the world, and it is a time of economic difficulty. There are college graduates with good skills who financially suffer because they do not have jobs. However, they don't have jobs because they search for well-paying jobs. In South Korea, there are three types of jobs that the unemployed avoid. They are difficult work, dirty work, and dangerous work. People talk about the lack of jobs, but they avoid these types of jobs. One pastor told a story of a young man. After graduated a prestigious university in Japan, he sold goods in front of Seoul Station in order to survive. Later, he found a well-paying job and he became a successful person. In the Bible, it says that one must not eat if he does not delight in working. It is honorable if a person works at a place that seems lowly and dangerous if he cannot find another job. Even Jesus said that we must not be anxious about what we will eat, but look to the birds in the air. If we work diligently, who feeds the birds in the air will provide us with food. If we believe in this promise and go out to work, God will surely lead us. In verse 3, Ruth went out to work, and she happened to go out to the field of Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. From a human perspective, it seemed coincidental, but God led Ruth's footsteps to Boaz's field. There is no coincidence in this world. One sparrow will not fall without God's permission. Therefore, everything that happens in the lives of God's people happens by the providence of God. God led Ruth's footsteps to Boaz's field to bless her because she followed her mother-in-law to Judah with faith. In verse 2, when Ruth was about to go to work, she asked her mother-in-law, "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain." Ruth did not want her mother-in-law to worry. If a foreign woman disappeared without a word or went to another place, her mother-in-law would become anxious. We believers must have proper relationships with God, and we must relationships with others. It was right for employees to ask permission of their employers before they carried out their work. Verse 4, just then Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. "The Lord be with you." "The Lord bless you," they called back. Boaz arrived from Bethlehem to his field and blessed the harvesters. "The Lord be with you." Then they called back, "The Lord bless you." This is a beautiful encounter. It is beautiful to see an employer bless the workers and see the workers bless their employer. This is to a successful family or business. Blessing one another is the secret to success. In some companies, employers do not pay their workers their due salary. They treat their employees poorly, and they make unfair requests. Consequently, such companies encounter hardships due to the conflict between management and workers. Employers must love and treat their employees well, and employees must be faithful to their superiors in order for there to be mutual success. It is beautiful to see people bless and encourage one another. Before Jesus his disciples to evangelize, he commanded them to bless the houses they entered. Verses 5 to 7, Boaz asked the foreman of his harvesters, "Whose young woman is that?" The foreman replied, "She is the Moabitess who came back from Moab with Naomi. she said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters." She went into the field and has worked steadily from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter. When Boaz returned to his field, he asked his harvesters about the young woman who was the. Then they replied, "She is the Moabitess who came back from Moab with Naomi." We can see Ruth's faith through the foreman's reply. He said that when Ruth arrived at the field, she asked for permission to pick up the leftover grain after she politely introduced herself to the workers. Of course, according to the law, Ruth was allowed to enter other people's fields and pick up leftover grain. However, it was meritorious to see that she asked the workers for permission. Also, she picked up grain from morning and other told Boaz that she was diligent in picking up grain. Through this, we can see that Ruth was faithful to her work. A believer of God must always be faithful in whatever he does. Students must study diligently. Workers must work diligently. People in management must work diligently. Those serving in the church must especially be faithful to their duties. Jesus gave us duties because he trusts us. Therefore, Paul said that those who have been given a trust must prove faithful. If we, the servants who were entrusted with 5 and 2 talents, the Lord will call us faithful and good servants. However, if we are unfaithful, like the servant who was entrusted with 1 talent, Jesus will call us wicked and lazy. Here we can see Ruth's faithfulness. Verses 8 to 9. So Boaz said to Ruth, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with my servant girls. Watch the field where the men are harvesting, and follow along after the girls, told them not to touch you, and whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled. Boaz helped Ruth. First, he told Ruth to drink from the water jars the men filled when she was thirsty. Workers became easily thirsty in that region because it was extremely hot in the Palestine land. The workers had lots of work to do, and so they brought water jars and drank from them. Boaz gave Ruth this privilege. Second, Boaz protected Ruth by ordering the men not to touch her. Regardless of a region, wicked men have sexually harassed and abused women. Because Ruth was a foreign woman alone in the field, there was the possibility that the men might harass her, and Boaz strictly ordered the men not to touch her in order to protect her. God gives food and water to those who go forward with faith, and God protects and guides them. During the time of King Ahab, God sent a great famine in the land because the Israelites were corrupted and continued to serve Baal and Asherah. The prophet Elijah with faith, and hence God led him to the Kerith ravine and gave him food through ravens. When the Kerith ravine dried up, God told Elijah to go to a widow in Zarephath, and she provided food for him. When believers keep their faith, God will give them food to eat and clothes to wear, and will guide them down good paths. Verse 10. At this she bowed down with her face to the ground. She exclaimed, "Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" Boaz showed kindness and Ruth expressed sincere gratitude towards Boaz. Believers of God must honor their superiors, especially if someone has helped us. We must not forget their grace and truly thank them. Verses 11 and 12. Boaz replied, I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. Here, Boaz blessed Ruth after he heard of her faith. First, he blessed Ruth for believing in God and leaving her parents and homeland to live in Israel. Ruth could not have done it without faith. Her faith was like the faith of Abraham when he journeyed out to a foreign land through faith in God's word. Second, Boaz blessed Ruth in the name of the Lord because she honored her mother-in-law after her husband's death. Today, because the world is evil, there are women who do not honor even if their husbands are alive. Also, there are women who honor their mothers-in-law while their husbands are alive, but dishonor their mothers-in-law when their husbands die. Unlike them, Ruth honored her mother-in-law after her husband's death and followed her to Judah. Also, Ruth's determination to serve her mother-in-law by picking up leftover grains was a manifestation of beautiful faith. That is why Boaz blessed her. Lastly, Boaz blessed Ruth's faith in finding refuge under the wings of God. Our God meets those who out grace and blessings on them. Verse 13. May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my Lord, she said. You have given me comfort and have spoken kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servant girls. When Boaz has blessed her, Ruth replied, May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my Lord. Here, Ruth confessed with a longing heart for God's grace that she hoped the blessings would become a reality in her life. Through this confession, we can see how much Ruth longed for God's grace, and God abundantly gives grace and blessings to those who seek them. Verses 14 to 16. At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come over here. Have some bread and dip it in the wine vinegar." When she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. As she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men. "Even if she gathers among the sheaves, don't embarrass her. Rather, pull out some stalks out for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up, and don't rebuke her." Boaz Ruth in many ways, who longed for the grace of God and had earnest faith. First, he provided food for her to fill her stomach with. Second, he ordered his harvesters not to rebuke her. Not only that, but he ordered them to pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick them up. Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is to look after orphans and widows in their distress. The law especially taught the people to help foreigners. We who have become children of God through our faith in Jesus Christ must glorify God through our good. Glory of God is manifested in our lives when we help others. One of the reasons why churches today are criticized by unbelievers is because churches do not love. We can only glorify God when we make sacrifices and help the distressed and comfort those who mourn. However, the glory of God is covered because we fight and quarrel out of selfishness. What benefits are there if we simply talk about love and say, "Fill your stomach," or "warm yourself with these clothes," without actually helping out our neighbors? Boaz bore beautiful fruit of faith before God. God's love and helped Ruth, a foreigner. Verses 17 to 19. So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. Then she threshed the barley she had gathered, and it amounted to about an ephah. She carried it back to town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered. Ruth also brought out and gave her what she had left over after she had eaten enough. Her mother-in-law asked her, "Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." Then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she had been working. "The name of I worked today is Boaz." Here we can see that Ruth picked up leftover grain until evening and explained the situation and showed the grain to her mother-in-law when she returned home. This showed true respect and consideration towards her mother-in-law. From Naomi's point of view, she was worried about Ruth's whereabouts after she went to work in fields as a foreigner. If Ruth came home and went into her room without a word because she was tired, her mother-in-law would have been frustrated. Thus, when Ruth explained what happened that day, Naomi must have rejoiced and been comforted. Time, many young adults hesitate to communicate with their parents. This then makes parents feel lonely. We believers must not be like this. Second, Ruth provided her mother-in-law with the food that Boaz provided. Ruth did not eat to fill her own hunger, but she showed love by bringing food to her mother-in-law, who was home alone all day. When I was young, I remember my mother brought me food after she came home from a feast. She did it because she loved me. In the same way, Ruth provided food for her mother-in-law because she loved her. Verse 20. "The Lord bless him," Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. "He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead." She added, "That man is our close relative. He is one of our kinsman redeemers." In this verse, Naomi thanked Boaz for not only thinking of Naomi and Ruth, but of her deceased husband Elimelech and her sons Mahlon and Chilion. She then said, "He is one of our kinsmen redeemers, according to the marital laws of the Israelites. If an elder brother died without a child, his younger brother was to marry his brother's widow. If birth to a child, he was considered the child of the deceased elder brother. Also, when a man sold his house or a field as a result of poverty, his brother was to restore the property by buying it again. Verses 21 to 23. Then Ruth the Moabitess said, "He even said to me, 'Stay with my workers until they finish harvesting all my grain.'" Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It will be good for you, my daughter, to go with his girls, because in someone else's field you might be harmed." So Ruth stayed close to the servant girls of Boaz to glean until and wheat harvests were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law. Ruth told Naomi that Boaz said to her, "Stay with my workers until they finish harvesting all my grain." When Naomi heard this, she sincerely thanked Boaz for protecting Ruth and for financially helping Ruth. Then she urged Ruth not to go anywhere or meet someone else. Naomi said this because wicked people might harm Ruth if she picked up leftover grain in another person's field. That is why Naomi urged Ruth not to leave Boaz's field, but to stay there and pick up the leftover grain. And she was able to serve her mother-in-law until the harvest season ended, because she picked up grain in Boaz's field under his protection. In chapter 2 of Ruth, we saw the beautiful faith of Boaz and Ruth. In Romans chapter 14, verse 18, it says, "Because anyone who serves in Christ in this way is pleasing to God and approved by men." We must glorify God by being upright before God and men, and we must receive blessings and grace from God. With this, we will conclude the third lecture on the book of Ruth.